This is the Definitely Uncertain podcast. Each week, we look at how high net worth families can improve their lives, decisions and investments in a deeply uncertain world. We always aim to provide practical information, even if we can't offer specific investment advice. Welcome everybody to this week's episode of the Definitely Uncertain podcast. My name is Darren Rockman. I'm a partner with the 20-year-old multifamily office Goldrock Capital, based in Israel and servicing clients here and around the globe. Today on the show, I am very pleased to welcome Harel Tow, who is an international tax partner at KPMG here in Tel Aviv. Hi, Harel.
Hi, Darren. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us on the show. So, as part of the COVID crisis, there have been lots of changes in life, and perhaps one of the most outstanding and revolutionary has been the reduction in international airline travel. Just to give you an example or an indication of how much the world has changed, in April of last year, every hour, 100,000 people went through TSA checkpoints in the United States. This year, on the same day in the middle of April, there were less than 5,000, a reduction of over 95%. That's created all types of problems for all types of people, business people, people that had holidays booked, but it also has created a problem for a group of people that you may not have expected. And those are people who don't live and work in just one country. And amongst our family office clients and other high net worth individuals, there are not a few people who have to deal with this particular issue. And Harel, I wanted to talk to you about it and what exactly this has meant for those individuals. So to set the scene, can you first explain to us a concept that many people are not familiar with, and that's the idea of residency or tax residence, and how that might be different, say, from citizenship?
Yeah, so thanks, Darren, for the outset. When we're talking about tax residency, at the end of the day, we were talking, at least from an Israeli standpoint, and we're dealing with a holistic test where we would look at one's center of life. In other words, where does the center of life exists? Center of life is a broad test that includes the place where the person lives, where his family resides, with him or without him, where his main business ties are, etc., or he belongs to organizations, etc., and his social networks, etc. So all of those indications would indicate towards one country or another, and that would be the center of life. In addition to that, and that's very important in the context of COVID, while the main test is center of life, the Israeli tax authorities have also provided with two numeric tests. One is quite famous. If you have been present in Israel for 183 days or more during the tax year, the presumption would be that you will be considered as an Israeli tax resident. Or there is an alternative numeric test. If you have been present in Israel for 30 days or more, or 425 days or more during the tax year plus 2 years prior to the tax year. Just as an anecdote, this is a presumption, and the Israeli tax authorities are using it as they see fit. So there is a very famous court case with regards to a poker player who stayed out of Israel for the far majority of the time, doing very well for himself in Vegas, in Australia, gambling and making millions and millions of dollars. He was only present in Israel for 30 days, 30. However, the Israeli tax authorities, with the support of Israeli courts, determined, unsurprisingly, that he should be considered as an Israeli tax resident.
Right.
So, yeah.
And that has nothing to do with what passport you own. You could be an American citizen, but still tax resident in Israel, or vice versa.
Yeah, that's correct. With Americans, it's a bit unique, because if you hold an American passport, then the U.S. has what we call the residual right to tax you. But in principle, it's definitely a different concept.
Okay. Yeah. So how's that definition been challenged by COVID and by the fact that people are unable, in large, to travel between countries?
Yeah, so I think that the reality of the business world and personal circumstances moves much faster than the tax authorities, unfortunately, and therefore the definition remains as it stands. However, the reality provides that many of our clients and many of the technology people who work, outside of Israel, mostly in the US. These people came back to Israel. Some of them are stuck in Israel, and then they would fall under one of the categories that I've mentioned with the numbers, and they would be deemed to be considered as Israeli tax residents, despite the fact that some of them, not all of them, but some of them cannot even leave the country. So that's, I think, the main change. In other words, there is a big group of people who stayed in Israel, like international business travelers, or simply people who work in multiple jurisdictions, and they are now stuck in Israel or in another jurisdiction, and they would be considered as Israeli tax residents or tax residents in the other jurisdiction.
Even though they had absolutely no choice in the matter, it was just enforced upon them by the circumstances. So what has different countries, how have they responded to this problem? Because I assume the tax authorities are aware of this issue.
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and my personal expectation would be from any tax authority to go forward and to provide some sort of a clarification, because during these difficult times, I think that's the expectation from governments. And in that vein, the OECD organization did provide for a notification that generally provides for the OECD's view and for certain reliefs. So, for example, if I'm an Israeli tax resident, and if I were to be in early March stuck in a project with KPMG Berlin, then based on OECD principles, the mere fact that I am now present in Germany for an extensive amount of time without the ability to go back to Israel would not necessarily make me a German tax resident. Mm-hmm. And in addition to that, and that's where it becomes very relevant to many of our technology founders who, say, left Israel, live for 4, 5, 6 years abroad, most of them in America, they would be considered as US tax resident. Now, if they came back to Israel, to their previous home, so to speak, then the OECD again provides that they should not necessarily be considered as Israeli tax resident. From the general, to put this more, to give specific examples, then the United States and the UK and Ireland, in Australia, all of those countries did provide for some clarification. Without getting into too many details, generally speaking, some of those countries provided for a 60 days relief. In other words, you can exclude from your total count days 60 days, which obviously makes a huge difference, because if the general threshold is 183 days, you've been in a country for 200 days, then if you're down to 140, that makes a huge difference.
Right. So has Israel also passed a 60-day rule similar to what's happened in other countries?
So the unsurprising answer is no. There was a very famous article on the Globes newspaper where the PR of the Israeli tax authorities reflected a very, I would say, strict message where Israel does not necessarily will not necessarily respect the OECD notification and memo on the matter, and despite the fact that we are an OECD country from 2010. However, I do want to point out that I did speak with the head of the international department at the tax authorities, and the view that I heard personally was a little bit softer, in the sense that, the Israeli tax authorities will look at the situation from a more holistic point of view, see the situation where you were present in 2021, 2022, or 2019, and if one could substantiate that he or she were present in Israel only due to COVID, then potentially the Israeli tax authorities may provide for a relief. In other words, there is no current final answer. They will be willing to consider. With the Israeli tax authorities, willing to consider is a good answer, as good as it gets. But I think it's better than the common knowledge in the market, at least, where people are frightened that they will not accept OECD's approach on that matter.
Okay, so someone who's stuck here in Israel, not usually resident in this country or any other country, what would you suggest that they do? What tips can you offer them in order to try and mitigate this problem that they've been forced into?
Yeah, so that's why it's good, Darren, that we're having this discussion exactly in mid-year, and so there is still a lot of room to change things. I think that the most basic thing would be to monitor your days, see if there is a possibility to get out of the country. For example, we had one guy who owns a private jet. He was trying to get out of Israel, traveled to an offshore country with his jet. They wouldn't let him in because it's an island. So he refueled, then he flew to Malta. They wouldn't let him in. Then he flew to the UK. We all know that the UK had at least a very specific approach with regards to COVID. And then he spent some time in the UK, went back to Israel. And this guy, for example, was within his 10 years tax holiday period. So he only pays tax on his Israeli sourced income. So obviously it makes a huge difference. Going back to your question, then monitor the days. I think that it's all about documentation in the tax world and not about philosophy as people tend to think. So if you are in contact with travel agencies, that's something that, I would document. If you stay in hotels or Airbnb, in other words, a place that is not permanent, that's something that you should be in a position to present to the Israeli tax authorities if you would be required.
So those are effectively to show that you weren't here permanently or that you were trying to get out.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, very good. Well, Harel, that's been very, very interesting, a fascinating angle on this crisis that I think a lot of people haven't thought about. And obviously, a lot of people should, certainly people who are caught in this quite weird situation. So thanks very much for joining on the show. We welcome everybody's feedback. So if you have any suggestions or ideas for further podcasts, please send us an email to podcast@goldrockcap.com. My name is Darren Rockman. Thank you, Harel, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you so much, Darren, for inviting me.